Hi, I am going to say welcome. I see one attendee has already logged in, and I see a second attendee. We're going to wait for a moment or two before we start this workshop so that we have more people logged in before we get started. So I appreciate your patience as we just wait to welcome a few more people into the virtual meeting. So welcome everyone. This is our third workshop on the Agricultural Enterprise Ordinance. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We wanted to give a chance for a few more people to arrive to our virtual meeting space before we jump into the workshop for tonight. So if you can just be patient for another moment or two, we'll get underway soon. For those who are just arriving, I would like to welcome you to this evening's workshop on the Agricultural Enterprise Ordinance. We are going to have multiple opportunities throughout the meeting to provide input on the development of the project. I do want to note that this workshop is being recorded, and it will also be available posted to our website after the workshop. Also, the workshop is streaming on YouTube, and if you prefer to just watch the presentation and not participate, you're welcome to do so on the YouTube channel. I believe our host is going to be soon putting a link to YouTube into the chat. The link is in the email that we sent out to everyone announcing the workshop, but also we should be able to have a link that you can get to from the chat if you want to switch over to that instead. And I'm only seeing about 6 people here so far, and I really hope that we have more attendees like we've had at our previous workshop. So I want to give it maybe just another moment before we get started. Okay, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started now. My name is Julie Harris. I am the project manager for the Long Range Planning Division, and I'm here this evening with Supervising Planner David Lackey, and we're leading the Ag Enterprise Ordinance Project. Also here tonight, we have Environmental Health Supervisor Jason Johnston with the county's Environmental Health Services, who can be available to answer questions on topics related to his work. And also tonight we have Fire Marshal Rob Hazard from County Fire, and he is also going to be available for Q&A on fire safety related topics. So next slide, please. So tonight we are fortunate to have our planning director, Lisa Plowman, here, and she's going to be attending our workshop this evening. And also, I think Director Plowman, you might want to say a few words before we continue further.
I did. Thank you, Julie. I just wanted to, I'm sorry we don't have more participants. I know that we did at our first 2 workshops, but I really wanted to thank everybody in the community for participating in this process. I mean, the real goal of the Ag Enterprise Ordinance is to make sure that we are thinking about the future of agriculture and thinking about how to sustain it in the long term in our community, and figuring out ways to provide alternative sources of income that help sustain agriculture. And so it's exciting to see the work so far that I've seen through these workshops. And I do want to remind everybody that this is not the end of the process. This particular project that we're working on, there is a phase 3 that may have sort of more complex or different types of allowed uses on agricultural land. So stay tuned. If the item that you're interested in seeing incorporated into our code isn't within the scope of the work that was directed by the board for this step of the process, then we can look at it in the third phase of this process. So again, I just really am excited to listen and hear what people have to say about the different opportunities. And again, thanks so much for participating. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Director Plowman. Without further ado, let's get busy because we do actually have a busy agenda of topics tonight, and we'd like to cover a number of them in this last workshop before we move forward with environmental review. In particular, tonight, we want to address a new addition to the project, and that's incidental food service at wineries located on the Ag 1 zone. And then we're going to move on and talk about small scale campgrounds, small scale events, educational opportunities, and time permitting, a brief review of the additional supplementary ag uses. Next slide. So for participation tonight, we are going to take a pause after we talk about each particular topic to take questions and comments so that we get a chance to look at each topic more in depth. And at that time, when we do pause for questions, we'd like you to submit them via the chat. We have a lot of topics to cover, and the chat feature seems to be a really good way to make efficient use of our time. Also, if you have any questions about the use of Zoom, which we are using for the first time tonight, please submit your questions to the meeting host, County PAD, and David Villalobos can help you out with some Zoom details. The notes for tonight's meeting will be taken live using Miro, a digital whiteboard, and then we will post those to the project website along with the recording of tonight's workshop. I also would like to request that people keep their comments and questions focused to each topic, and near the end of the workshop, we'll open the floor for general questions and comments and include an opportunity for people to come off the mute button and speak to the group. So, and then at that general Q&A, that'll be the time to bring up any final comments or questions you have about the project in general, as this will be our last public workshop before environmental review. Next slide. So for a quick recap of our last workshop, we talked about the micro enterprise home kitchen operation, or MICO, which would allow one type of food service within a residential kitchen. Per state law, zoning requirements are not required for a MICO, but an environmental health permit is. Also, last time we heard from Environmental Health Services regarding food facility permit requirements, as well as water supply and wastewater disposal requirements. We also discussed exemption and low-level permit options for cooking classes, farm-to-table dinners, and incidental food service. Next slide. So talking about incidental food a little bit more, at the last workshop, we presented the concept that incidental food could be allowed on Ag 2 zoned lands only as a supplemental and incidental use to other ag enterprise uses that bring members of the public to the property. And examples of those ag enterprise uses that bring the public to the farm include the educational activities, farm tours, farm stands, horseback riding, and winery tasting rooms. So since that last workshop, staff has been asked to also consider the incidental food service at all winery tasting rooms on the Ag 1 zone, in addition to those on the Ag 2 zone. So that's just a little bit of an expansion of the project. Next slide. So with the new direction to consider incidental food service for the Ag 1 winery tasting rooms, in addition to Ag 2, we recognize that there's an even greater challenge to distinguish between what is incidental food service and then what is a restaurant, which the Board of Supervisors, they didn't ask us to go all the way down to a restaurant type of use. And so we're still trying to tease out those differences between what's incidental for tasting rooms, but still not be a restaurant. So last time, as we were considering what would be incidental for all Ag 2, but also for tasting rooms, we think that similar to last time, incidental food on all Ag 2 lands would only be allowed during the hours of operation. And so if we extend that concept to the tasting room, then the incidental food service would only be allowed during the operation of the tasting room as set by the winery's permit. Also, as we discussed last time, staff is considering the types of food service on the left side of this slide to be at a small scale, a small enough scale to potentially qualify for an exemption from zoning permits. And so these kinds of food service or food sales include non-potentially hazardous prepackaged foods, other prepackaged foods such as cheeses or charcuterie, salads or sandwiches, prepackaged meals or picnic foods that would be prepared by an off-site restaurant but delivered to the tasting room, and food trucks, which can also incorporate a pizza oven or a barbecue on the food truck. Another concept that staff is considering for the winery tasting rooms as a part of the tasting rooms permit is some kind of limited food service that might allow like small wine and food pairings, such as appetizers or tapas that are paired to complement each wine that's being tasted. But now, as we prepare to go to our first set of questions and comments, we really want to hear from the public here tonight regarding what should be incidental at a winery tasting room, but still for all practical purposes, not be a restaurant. So next slide. And let's switch over to the Miro board. And I'd like to invite people to put their thinking caps on and give us some questions and comments about incidental food service at wineries. If you can put those in the chat, we will take those comments and do our best to respond to them. So we're still looking for some comments. I see that one hand is raised, and we'd like to ask you if you could save that for the end of the meeting. We're planning to just do a verbal Q&A at the end of the workshop. So I have somebody asking to clarify what we're asking for. So what we're looking for now is whether any of you attending tonight have some ideas about what you think would be or should be considered incidental food or incidental food service at a winery tasting room. We presented some options that we've been thinking about here with staff and some options that we've heard from some other people previously. But what we'd really like to hear is whether you all have any other ideas that you haven't heard presented tonight, or if you really like the ideas that you've heard tonight, to let us know. I see that one person has commented already that they did like the options tonight. Okay. So we have one person asking, what safeguards will be in place to keep other types of events to use the exempt provision as loopholes to get other type of events to occur under the radar? I think this is a little, there's kind of like two prongs going on. For one thing, right now, we're just talking about food service and not events. And we are looking at a small scale events kind of ag enterprise that we're going to be talking about a little bit later tonight. So I'm wondering if perhaps that question might be more appropriate then. Maybe we can hear a little bit more from the person who asked that question.
Just to add on to that, Julie, you had mentioned in your previous slide of looking at incidental food that it was incidental to some of the other agricultural enterprise uses. And so since we are looking at small scale events, and we'll have that discussion, but those event activities that qualify as under the AEO program would also have opportunities for incidental food that Julie was talking about in terms of some of the exempt categories that are prepackaged for their events. A lot of those small scale events may also have catering options for that food if appropriate. So I think some of that may come together a little bit more clearly when we talk about the small scale events, but in general, it would be one of those qualifying ag enterprise uses that could also take advantage of the incidental food uses that we're talking about today.
Thank you, David. I hope that helped to clarify a little bit, but I think we have one person who's asked, could these incidental food service options be open to other ag properties such as farms and ranches? So I think David touched on that question a little bit. So we are looking at incidental food, and we talked about that at the last workshop. That would be open to all farms and ranches within the Ag 2 zone. And I know we may have to go back to that slide for a moment, but we had included a number of uses that we think could be exempt. And those are uses that we are thinking about. So yes, on this slide, these uses on the left-hand side, we're thinking about these as being potential exempt uses for all Ag 2 lands. So not just provided that they occur in conjunction with some other ag enterprise use that brings the public to the land. And so that's kind of what we've been talking about for the last 2 workshops. But then tonight we're trying to do a little extra focus on the winery tasting rooms, which is why we asked some additional questions. I have a question about what's the difference between having a food truck used at a winery versus a kitchen at the winery. So the difference is a food truck is a mobile food facility. It gets its own kind of mobile food facility permit, and the food truck operator has to get that permit directly from environmental health. And that allows the food truck operator to go and park that food truck at different locations and sell food directly from the food truck. Whereas a kitchen at the winery is a kitchen that would have to get a permit from the environmental health services directly if that kitchen is going to be used to prepare food of any kind and of any scale, and then sell that food to the public. And if I didn't answer that well enough, I would encourage Jason Johnston to jump in on that.
No, you did. The big thing is that if the food truck has their own equipment on board, you're not going to have all the infrastructure that would go along with it for the same types of foods prepared. So if you were going to prepare what a lot of food trucks prepare, you would be increasing the septic system, the water system. You'd have grease interceptors, things like that. So it provides a larger menu than you could necessarily do without major infrastructure changes at the winery.
Okay, thank you, Jason. So we have a couple of other comments that I'll read into the record. Someone says, I think it's a great idea to get the drinkers eating something before getting out on our roads. I think most people would agree with that. The next commenter says, your options are too restrictive. Use the definition of incidental. And as is already included in the winery ordinance, that tasting rooms are incidental, accessory, and subordinate to the primary operation of the associated winery as a production facility. The existing provisions also already allow for sales of wine-related items and other products that reflect or enhance the character or theme of the winery. Okay, thank you for that comment. And we have another comment that says it would help to know those other ag uses and not solely wineries. So I think in response to that comment, I think what we mentioned is the kind of other ag uses that we're thinking about that would bring the public to the property and where we think it would be appropriate to have an incidental food service are the educational opportunities and activities, which we're going to talk about a little more tonight. But that's one of the ag enterprise uses that we're looking at as a part of this project. Farm tours is another one. Farm stands is a use that is already allowed. And it's a use that brings people to the property. So we're looking at this as being something supplemental and, you know, looking for a small scale of food that could be provided at the farm stands in addition to the selling of the produce that's grown on the site. Another example is the horseback riding. We have several other uses that we'll talk about later, which could bring people to the site. And then we mentioned the tasting room. So those are some of those examples. So I'll just give us a moment to see if anybody has some additional thoughts that they would like to share. Okay, well, if no more thoughts now, we're going to move on to our next topic. If we can return to the slides, but we will have that general Q&A at the end of the meeting where you'll be welcome to comment more about the incidental food service at wineries.
Julie, this is Lisa. I had a question on, there was the comment about that these were too restrictive, but I was interested if that commenter could be more specific about what they think should be allowed in terms of food service. And I you know, I don't know that this is my first remote workshop, so I'm not familiar with how you guys are moving about, but that was one question I had from that commenter, is if they could elaborate on what they think the food service should look like.
I'll give that.
Yeah.
As I say, I'll give that commenter a moment to
Respond.
yeah.
Thank you.
So we've heard that this commenter would like to speak about it. So I know that this format has worked just fine in our other workshops. But we do have an opportunity that to speak more fully about that at the end.
So I think maybe for this one, since it's a request on our behalf for the commenter to speak, maybe if the commenter could raise their hand and then maybe David could call on them for this response.
That would be great.
Okay. I think you lowered your hand. Your hand was lowered. There we go. Mr. Wolbrand, I believe. Go ahead.
Thanks. And I mean, I haven't found this process to be particularly great. I would love it if we could have a process which is more interactive rather than me trying to type these really long comments. But in general, for the past 18 months during the COVID time, the county adopted an emergency ordinance which has allowed for food service generally at wineries. I have not heard a single complaint. And in fact, Commissioner Park asked at one of the recent planning commission hearings whether P&D had gotten any complaints about food service at wine during this period. And the answer was that there have been no complaints. I think that a general concept, which is that food service is incidental to the production and tasting and offering of sale of wine, then keeps this from becoming a restaurant. A provision that the general public cannot come just for food service, that again, it must be incidental to the production and offering of sale of the wine product, would work really well. And in fact, I've got the existing winery ordinance in front of me. There is nothing in the winery ordinance which prohibits the sale of food. It has, in some occasions, popped up as a specific condition of approval for wineries. In the 2016 winery ordinance proposal, staff did propose to prohibit sale of food, but of course, that ordinance was then killed by the Board of Supervisors. So I would just urge, this is one where it ain't broke, and I would go back to something along the lines of the ordinance that the board approved as an urgency ordinance, and just eliminate the conditions for incidental food service in any permits that ended up with such conditions. The next issue is whether or not one can actually have an on-site kitchen. And that's where the regulation does, in fact, currently occur. And I think that's where we need environmental health services review of things like grease traps and product waste disposal, including the waste disposal from the kitchen. But again, I would urge, come up with a definition. There actually is already a really good one in the winery ordinance for tasting rooms that require that tasting rooms must be clearly incidental, accessory, and subordinate to the primary operation of the associated winery. And so if food service were also accessory and subordinate to the primary operation of the associate winery, then you get rid of this unintended possibility that somebody's going to slide a restaurant in under their winery permit. The other, I know you said you're going to get to the issue on special events. There also was a special events ordinance that was processed, taken to the Board of Supervisors, which decided not to implement that. And I've looked at some of the specific numbers that staff is proposing for things like cooking classes, and they are all extremely limited in scale and number, and are inconsistent with the provision in the winery ordinance, which regulates special events, but also actually has a definition for what a special event is. And a special event involves 80 or more guests. And so, again, the numbers that you're using are actually creating additional restriction rather than additional opportunity. And
Hey,
I'm gonna
Chip,
just one.
we're not on that yet. And so it would be really helpful if you could just respond to that one question that I had, and then
Okay.
when we move on, then you can post some of your comments. Thank you.
I hope I did, which was my suggestion. There already is a definition for incidental within the winery ordinance. So why not go ahead and use that and make it clear that that definition also applies to food service.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments, Mr. Wolbrandt. I just wanted to make a couple comments. You mentioned the COVID ordinance. That is a temporary relaxation of ordinance standards. It's very general, so it does not specifically address incidental food service. So I don't think we could just rely on that. And restaurants are not allowed in the ag zones at all, not even with a conditional use permit. So we do have to tread carefully as we set up allowing the incidental food service at wineries as well as elsewhere on the Ag 2 zone lands. So with that, I'd like to move on to our next topic. So small scale campgrounds. The small scale campground is a use that is currently allowed within the Gaviota Coast Plan area with a land use permit. The small scale campground standards, as presented on this slide, were set by the County Planning Commission when they reviewed the plan for adoption, and they were subsequently adopted by the Board of Supervisors. These standards include a maximum of 10 campsites at a property, 2 vehicles per campsite maximum, up to 1/2 of the total campsites on the property could be used for RVs or camp trailers. And again, no more than 2 per site would be allowed. And the RVs or camp trailers could not exceed 25 feet in length. And then the campground could allow up to a 14-day maximum stay. So this particular land use permit scale was adopted for the Gaviota Coast Plan, and anything larger than this would be allowed with a conditional use permit. Outside of Gaviota, a campground of any size or configuration can be allowed currently with a conditional use permit. So it could be something really large on the scale of El Capitan Canyon Ranch, which has all sorts of different camp type uses, or it could be as small as a 10 campsite, which would require the conditional use permit. So we do want to open this up to be more flexible throughout Ag 2. What we heard at the first workshop is that small scale campgrounds should have no more than 10 campsites. So that's kind of the initial public comment we've received. But as we go through the next slide with another point to make about what we're looking at, keep in mind what you think a small scale campsite should be and some of these other standards, and think about those for our discussion when we take a break to talk about this. So next slide. So our staff has received a number of comments at various different venues, including the farm stay workshop, asking us whether they could allow landowners to provide various kind of maybe glamping opportunities, like the landowner providing RVs or camp trailers like Airstreams, or yurts or tent cabins or park trailers, and that these be provided to potential visitors instead of the visitors bringing their own camping equipment or tents. These options, having these different kinds of semi-permanent structures, are allowed with the conditional use permit. So they are currently allowed anywhere, but they're not allowed under the small scale land use permit in Gaviota. And it's something we've been asked to consider as we move forward with the small scale version for the rest of Ag 2. So we will consider these uses as part of our low level permit option. But I also wanted to point out that we would have to look at these semi-permanent structures and consider standards that would seek to balance user experiences and the types of camping so that it doesn't just become, all or nothing. Again, the focus of the Ag Enterprise Ordinance is to be incidental to the primary ag use of the land. And we'll also be consulting with building code and fire code requirements that may affect what kind of standards would apply if any of these particular kind of structures were used. But before we move on to questions and comments, I would like to ask a question of some of our other county staff who's here tonight. So I would like to call on Fire Marshal Hazard if he could discuss a little bit about some of the fire safety concerns that the county fire department has with campgrounds.
All right. Hi, Julie. Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we can.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rob Hazard. I'm the fire marshal for Santa Barbara County Fire Department. And we've been collaborating with planning and development in this issue and looking at some of the issues that are oriented around private campgrounds, small scale campgrounds. So for addressing the fire concerns, we would approach small scale campgrounds just like any occupancy where we regulate fire code. We would be looking at defensible space and approaching similar to our private residences out in the high fire hazard areas where we require 100 foot of clearance, in some cases more than that. We'd be looking at access and egress, so the road standards, how the campground folks are going to get out of the campgrounds and how the fire department's going to get in. And we would be looking at the water supply requirements. We have standards for all new development in the county, and we'd be applying those same standards. One tool that we have within our fire protection ordinance is we can require a fire protection plan for any type of occupancy that where we deem it to be necessary. And we've made a decision that any of these small scale campgrounds, we would require a fire protection plan. It's not an onerous requirement for the project proponent. It would be something that we would collaborate with them on, but it would address those issues, the defensible space requirements, the access and egress, road standards, the water supply, evacuation concerns. So we feel like we have enough tools right now to ensure that these operations would be as fire safe as possible.
Thank you. And I would like to turn now to Jason Johnston and ask if he's got anything, if he can say anything in particular about water supply or wastewater disposal with respect to small campgrounds.
It would, the water supply again would depend on users per day and duration, whether or not it would trigger the public water system requirements. There would be requirements for wastewater disposal, whether it's a communal shower bathroom or some sort of RV dump station, depending on the type of use. RV dump stations are difficult to permit just because of the chemicals used in those holding tanks. So that would likely be a type of holding tank more than actual septic system. We would have to look into the full planned layout and whether it triggers some of the housing community development standards. Depending on the configuration, it may trigger Title 25 requirements for the number of facilities and types of wastewater disposal, as well as water supply.
Okay, thank you, Jason. All right, with that, let's move on to our next slide. And I'd like people to think about small scale campgrounds, and let's move on to our next whiteboard here. And we'd like to hear from you about small scale campgrounds, what you think would be appropriate. I think again, we gave you the parameters of what was approved for the Gaviota Coast Plan, maximum of 10 campsites, 2 vehicles per site. Any RV or trailer would need to be no more than 25 foot long. And all of that would be allowed with the land use permit. So we're thinking about, expanding this use to all Ag 2. And so we're like you to be thinking about that expanded use and let us know what you think about the number of campsites, as well as some of these alternative options and the provision and whether the county should allow the landowners to provide some of these semi-permanent structures like the trailers or park trailers or yurts or other kinds of tent cabins. So I think we've got one comment already, a question. How exactly does the small scale campground provisions conform, conflict, or overlap with the farm stay ordinance provisions? And why are the two ag-related projects being processed separately when there appears to be a significant overlap? I think I am going to ask David if he could respond to that, since he's been working on both projects.
Sure. Good question. Again, both of these, sort of their genesis came out of the Gaviota Coast Plan and were adopted there as sort of distinct new supplemental uses on ag land. The farm stay, for example, is a lodging opportunity that's in Gaviota would only be allowed within existing single family residence. What we're looking at with our current farm stay ordinance is to expand that flexibility, and not only that the farm stay could be accommodated within the residence, but also potentially within some of the, either new structures like small cottages or park trailers that are similar, that could also be considered at the campground, or it could be in a converted existing structure, and that's where the lodging. So there's commonalities in terms of both a campground and the farm stay providing some lodging opportunities. They're distinctly different in Gaviota, where campground is truly looking at campsites and a mix of campsites, both tent camping or potentially RV trailers that would come into the site. The similarities are actually overlapping a little bit more with what we're looking at in the expansion of the uses on farm stays. So there are commonalities in lodging that's incidental in scale to the primary agriculture. In terms of, as Julie had mentioned, in terms of the lodging accommodations, both the farm stay and the campgrounds, small scale campgrounds, are potentially looking at either park trailers or RV Airstream type trailers that could be in place on a foundation to provide some of the mix of those accommodations. So there are some overlap, but there are differences in terms of how and what type of lodging and accommodations are being provided by campgrounds versus the farm stay.
Okay, thank you, David. We had another question there about if one CEQA document is being prepared, and the answer to that question is no, there will be two CEQA documents. There's one being prepared for the farm stay as it is being processed as a separate ordinance amendment. And then we were going to be preparing a CEQA document, an EIR, for the Ag Enterprise Ordinance. Another question we have is why the 25-foot limitation? And another question that's kind of related is why half tent and half trailers? And I think both of those questions come out of the adoption process of the Gaviota Coast Plan. Both of those standards were set by the Planning Commission during their review of the Gaviota Coast Plan. And I believe that they set those standards primarily because they were concerned about the balance of uses between ensuring that all people had opportunities to camp on a site. But I think they were concerned that if it was all trailers and all large, that it would become a visual situation on the Gaviota Coast. And I think that's what they were trying to protect, were visual resources. So I appreciate the question and I appreciate the comments. So it sounds like we've already got a couple of other commenters coming up to not limit them to 25 feet. So, so we'll be keeping that in mind. We have another commenter about water and wastewater being the biggest hurdle and how is that working out in Gaviota? I have not personal knowledge of a proposed small scale campground on Gaviota, so I'm not sure I can answer that question. But we'll look into that and try to get an answer that we can add to these notes before we post them on the website. Let's see. We have a comment that county parks at Lake Kachuma and Halama allow tent camping, RVs longer than 25 feet, yurts, and park trailer cabins, and that the mix works well. Why reinvent the wheel for private landowners? And the limit to 10 campsites for large parcels is too small. So I appreciate those comments. First of all, the balance of use at both Lake Kachuma and Halama are very large campgrounds, and those are their primary uses. They are campgrounds. What we are looking for with the Ag Enterprise is a small scale version that will still be incidental to and supplemental to the primary use of the ag. There still needs to be agriculture going on the site for this to work. Today, if a landowner wanted to have a big campground with a lot of different camping opportunities, they could pursue that with a conditional use permit. An example is El Capitan Canyon Ranch out on the Gaviota coast, which has a conditional use permit and has all of those different uses as a part of their campground. But again, we're looking at small scale and incidental. So if 10 campsites is too small, then the question would be, well, what would be appropriate for a large parcel and still be incidental to that parcel having agricultural operation? We have a question, would fire department require paved roads to the campsite, or is dirt okay? Can I ask Rob Hazard to answer that question?
Yep. So we would just apply our normal road standards. So we would require all-weather roads. They only need to be paved if they're steeper grade than 10%, 10 to 15%. If they're over 50%, they have to be engineered concrete. So similar standard that we're applying to any development project. So any grade below 10% would basically be a graveled road, class 2 aggregate over a compacted subgrade soil.
Rob, I have a follow-up question. Is there any requirement for secondary access to the property?
So in the fire code, secondary accesses are required for residential developments that are unsprinkled. When you have more than 30 units, or when you have sprinkled residences above 200 units. So trying to apply that to a campground would be, we would need something in our local ordinance. I think that there could be a concern with some of our agricultural parcels. Trying to engineer a secondary road could be difficult with our existing topography and constraints of trying to build a road through some of our wildland areas. So I think, again, that goes back to the fire protection plan requirement that we would place on these projects. We would look at those individual circumstances and work with the project proponent instead of trying to put a blanket standard on all of these operations. It'd be case by case.
All right. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, our next comment is do not limit park models to 25 feet. Park models are up to 400 square feet in size and over 25 feet in length. So owners would be able to provide should be able to provide park models. Also, the number of camping units should be selected based on the property size. The Ag Enterprise Work Group provided P&D language that would allow 3 units per 20 acres. I think up to a total of 30 for very large 600-acre premises. Thank you for those comments. We will be looking at park models and finding out more about them because that could obviously create some conflict. So if we're going to allow them, we need to have standards that will fit. We have another person saying park models should be easier to permit from an environmental health perspective as they use a conventional toilet. One park model should equal 1 bedroom for environmental health services. So I don't know if Jason Johnston has anything to say about that, but certainly that would be addressed through the provision of a wastewater system for the campground.
Yeah, I mean, we would base it on the same as any other construction. So it would just, yeah, I mean, I don't think it'd be easier or more difficult. It just makes it easy to know what the standard we're applying is.
Okay, Jason, I might ask you to answer this other question that's come in, as someone asked, how difficult will it be to get permits for communal bathroom shower? Or do you think it is more likely to do this by bringing in the rentable ones?
If it's a permanent campground, and I mean, these are larger parcels. I mean, we're talking 40 acres. There should be suitable soils to do some sort of dispersal field. In the long term, a conventional septic system is going to be a lot cheaper than renting and hauling off-site wastewater, because you're still going to need to have a water source. Maybe in the short-term feasibility, seeing if this is something someone wants to really develop, we can entertain, temporary uses of a rented trailer unit. But in the long term, overall, fixed infrastructure would be the way that we'd have to go.
Thank you. We have another question here. What about off-grid self-contained vehicles smaller than 25 feet? By that, I think by self-contained, I think we're meaning a small RV that has its own holding tank and facilities. And that is probably something that could be considered, is the allowance of a small RV or a trailer at a campground where there aren't any hookups and there is no dump station. And then they would have to take their vehicle and when they leave the site, they would have to take it somewhere else. So let's take a moment and see if we've got any other interested commenters. So we have a new question. Would yurts or tents, non-permanent structures, be allowed for day use and not overnight camping? I think I would like to ask the commenter to clarify on that question. I'm not sure what the day use would be, since right now this whole focus is on overnight camping. So I'd be interested to understand more what the thoughts going into that question. So we have a question, why would that vehicle be smaller than 25 feet? I think that is a question from one commenter to another commenter. Okay. Do we have any more comments? Is anybody considering adding anything else to our comments right now or questions. If not, I would like to move on to our next topic. We still have a couple more big topics to get through this evening. And back to our slides. So to identify the size and scale of the standards to suggest permit thresholds for small scale events, staff considered a couple of key factors. The first were results to the survey that was conducted earlier this year. And the second factor are the current Land Use and Development Code, or LUDC standards. So first, our survey asked an open-ended question: how many people attending an event should be considered small scale? Of the 81 people who responded with an actual number of attendees, over 2/3, or about 68%, said that the small scale should be 50 attendees or fewer. And in addition, at the first workshop, when asked a similar question, there were 5 workshop attendees who responded in the chat that 50 or below would be the appropriate number. We really didn't get any other numbers at the first workshop. We also looked at responses to this survey question to glean ideas regarding what an acceptable frequency would be. And the highest number of respondents gave us numbers between 8 to 12 times per year, or roughly about once a month. Next slide. So I mentioned that in trying to devise some possible standards for a small scale event, we looked at another consideration, and that was what are some of the existing LUDC regulations. And most of these in general are addressed through the temporary uses section of the LUDC. The exception is events at wineries, which are addressed specifically in the winery section of the LUDC. And the current effort with this project is to not expand the winery event regulations or their exceptions to the rest of the Ag 2 lands, because the wineries are approved through a very rigorous winery permit process, whereas the Ag enterprise uses and allowing small scale events on these other Ag properties, this is an effort to find an appropriate level of use that's incidental to the primary use of the land in agriculture, for which there are no existing permits required, and there is no other permit review going on as there are at wineries. So considering the current LUDC regulations, some events are exempt from permits, and others may require a land use permit or a minor conditional use permit, depending on the type of event. For example, charitable and non-commercial events are allowed on the Ag 2 zone without a permit if no more than 300 people attend, while larger events would require a land use permit. Also, large single-day events that are more community focused require a land use permit. And then reception type uses, including parties and weddings and similar gatherings, are all allowed on the Ag 2 zone with a minor conditional use permit. The LUDC doesn't dictate the size or frequency. It is decided on a site specific, case by case basis, taking into account all of the specific issues of that site, including size, where it's located, et cetera. So staff has done some permit history review as well to get a sense of what were the most commonly approved parameters under the minor conditional use permit on Ag 2 zones. And we found that typically the request or the approved permit was for a maximum of 150 attendees and about a dozen events per year, with no more than 2 per month, to avoid neighborhood incompatibility issues. So next slide, please. So also at our previous workshop, we received comments that we were trying too hard to tease apart and treat all of these different uses separately and suggesting too many different options for exemptions and permits depending on the use. So for example, last time we suggested a particular set of standards for a cooking class regarding its size and frequency, and then a different set for farm to table dinners. So hearing those comments, that got us thinking about trying to come up with an alternative and perhaps a simpler approach. And so we wanted to bring that to the group this evening and propose that to you all. And under this idea, we thought, well, why not group more uses under the small scale events category and then define the thresholds of event size based on the number of attendees and event frequency based on the number of events per year or per month, and use that to determine a small scale exemption level of permits, and then larger events would then require permits. So under our original concept, we were talking about the receptions, parties, weddings, and similar gatherings, and we would still include those, but we would also group other kinds of uses as events, including the farm to table dinners and the cooking classes, because they're really similar kinds of gatherings. So under this concept, it would simplify the regulations a little bit and allow a landowner to mix and match the kind of events that they can host. Next slide. So taking into consideration all of these different factors, we thought we would put out for discussion and consideration some particular numbers, because you've got to start somewhere, right? We have to start our discussion somewhere. So under this mix and match scenario, we have proposed thresholds that are aligned with the responses that we received in the survey in the first workshop, and that a small scale exempt level series of small scale events should be 50 or fewer attendees, no more than 8 per year, and no more than 2 times per month. And then the land use permit level would increase the number of attendees up to 80, 12 events per year, but still limit it to no more than 2 per month, so that we maintain with these low level permits and exemptions a level of frequency that's not going to generate significant neighborhood compatibility issues. And then the larger, more frequent events would then fall within the current minor conditional use permit process that is allowed today. These thresholds are intended to allow the smaller ag enterprise events that are truly small scale and supplemental to the primary use of land of agriculture. And these uses should not be allowed at a level of intensity that would create a de facto event venue. The larger scale should still require the kind of review as a conditional use. Something to keep in mind, it has been our intent to outline these thresholds at levels that would not necessitate the need for infrastructure that would in turn simply force a landowner into obtaining a land use permit anyways for the infrastructure. Next slide. So with those thoughts in mind, let's take another pause here for some discussion about small scale events and what do you think looks like small scale while still supporting and being supplemental and incidental to the primary use of the land as agriculture.
And Julia, I'll just add, I think we had talked about for the remaining topics, and also since we have relatively lower numbers of attendees, that we would also open up if you can either submit your comments through chat, or if you would like to verbally comment, please raise your hand and then we'll call on you. And then the other concept in terms of the events that we also will be looking at is the concept of scalability in terms of the numbers and as they may relate to and may be appropriate on larger ranches. So that will be another concept that we'll be looking at more.
So our first comment we have, someone asks, am I correct that the thresholds suggested are for non-commercial? What we are looking at is, I suppose you could say commercial. That's not really the word that we want to use, but what we're looking at for these small scale events is an ag enterprise that allows the landowner, the farmer, to basically rent a portion of his property for an event, and so actually do get some remuneration for that. Whereas the current ordinance, which allows charitable events for up to 300 people without permits, those charitable events, the landowner can't receive any money for that. You know, they can't charge a fee to rent out their property for use as an event. So, so the intent here is that, yes, a landowner could potentially make a little bit of money from the events. That's the whole point of our ag enterprise ordinance, is to allow these small scale uses that a farmer or a rancher can use to supplement the income on their farm while still continuing to farm and ranch the land. We do have a comment about numbers should be relative to the size of the parcel, and I think David Lackey just mentioned that is something that we're also gonna keep looking at. And another comment, the threshold should be scalable based on premise size, because a 5,000 acre area or property is going to be different than in a neighborhood of smaller ag parcels. We have a question, are you going to discuss the fee structure for these permits at some point? It would be great to see a sliding scale based on revenue to ensure equitable access to permits. Well, currently, we weren't going to talk about fees tonight, but just for some basic information, if a use is set up in our ordinance to be exempt from permits, a landowner is not required to come into the planning department to get an exemption. They just have to comply with the standards that allow the use to be exempt. A landowner could come to the department and ask for an exemption if they want to have something to, say, show a neighbor. And there is a fee associated with an exemption, although it's pretty nominal. But other permits, land use permits, we would have to look at that in the future. You know, once an ordinance is actually developed, we would have to look at what would be the appropriate fee schedule for a land use permit. And conditional use permits are typically just on an hourly reimbursable basis. Let's see, we have another comment that says, I would raise the number of events to at least 12 for exempt. Thank you. We have a question, does educational experiences fall under this? That is a really good question, and I like it because that's actually going to be the topic we're talking about next. And so keep thinking about that as we move on to the next topic. Let's see. We have another question about how hard is it to get a land use permit and how much does it cost to get through the review process? Again, that's a difficult question to answer in the workshop. A lot depends upon what use is involved and what kind of standards have to be reviewed as a part of that land use permit process. Let's see, we have another comment about the CEQA on these numbers will require a significantly more robust analysis and discussion to make some de minimis and other statutorily exempt as a ministerial permit. It seems like the county should be looking at discretionary approvals as the default rather than exemptions in land use permits. Okay, thank you for those comments.
And Julie, I think I
Okay.
saw a raised hand request.
Yes, I was just going to say that. I think we've got a raised hand. So let's take John Park. If you can unmute yourself, you will have the floor here for a moment.
Just a moment. I think that this is a clever idea to group these things for purposes of a simpler ordinance and efficiency. I think that's a good idea. On the other hand, maybe it goes too far because some things that you've listed in, for example, farm to table or cooking classes, they're more clearly related to the underlying agriculture. They're part of the let's share the agricultural experience. Weddings and parties are just let's have a pretty place to do this thing. And so I just kind of have a feeling that maybe the number of attendees shouldn't be so different depending on event to event. But if it's something that's so clearly related to the underlying agricultural use of the property, I would suggest that allowing a greater frequency is a better idea. You know, that a farm to table dinner, or a cooking class, or some kind of educational experience, which I know you're going to get into, could be more frequent than say weddings and parties and things. I'd like that to be considered. But very interesting ideas. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Commissioner Park. I appreciate that. You know, we have been trying to think about, you know, come up with different ideas and look at these things in different ways. So it's really helpful to get people's input on these different ideas, and we'll definitely take those into consideration. Let's see. I don't see any more raised hands. I'm looking to see if we have any other comments in the chat.
There's another raised hand.
There's another raised hand now. Mary Hayden, please unmute yourself and speak.
Sorry, I meant to hit the chat button, so never mind. Sorry.
Sure, no
Bye.
problem. So I'll give Mary Hayden a chance to put her comment in the chat. Okay, we're getting some agreements, and we're getting some agreements with Commissioner Park's comments. So thank you for all of that. I can see this is gonna continue to be a really interesting project as we move on into the environmental review phase of the project and take more feedback later on. But I think with that, we'll move on to educational opportunities and experiences. Our next slide. So this idea, the educational experiences and opportunities, actually also came out of the Gaviota Coast Plan and a definition of agriculture and natural resource educational experiences that was defined and adopted, but the actual uses were not adopted as part of the Gaviota Coast Plan. So we wanted to start with that definition that is in the LLDC as a starting point for looking at this particular ag enterprise. And we would propose to expand the definition to include not only workshops that are geared specifically towards technical agricultural topics for the farmer or the rancher, which was the focus of the definition, but also include educational opportunities for the general public to learn about farming or ranching, to learn about the natural resources that are found on the property, other activities like bird or wildlife viewing, botany, photography, or farm tours, just getting a tour of the farm either on foot or by bike or by e-bike, or maybe even by motorized vehicle. But what we're talking about here in this case is a tour and not a recreational use such as, off-roading or ATV riding. Those recreational uses could be considered as part of the future project that Director Plowman mentioned earlier, or perhaps if they're recreational, they might be considered as a part of the recreational master plan and some ordinance amendments that the planning and development may do in the future in order to implement the recreational master plan. And then next slide. And then the key attributes that we're thinking would be a part of these uses is that they're, by their character, low intensity. They're really about, bringing visitors to the farm for an educational experience that is directly related to the farm's agricultural or natural resource. And this would be different from events, which are more about offering the farm or ranch as a backdrop for what is essentially a non-agricultural use. So with this in mind, we're thinking about allowing an exemption with possibly more attendees and a higher yearly frequency with an exemption than we would for the small scale events. And so we'd like to know what you think about that, whether the educational experiences should be considered separately from the small scale events, which is what our initial thought process was, whether educational experiences should be more permissive. And I think with, I guess alternatively, which I think somebody was mentioning in the previous discussion is, should we instead lump these together with the mix and match approach for small scale events? So with that, I'd like us to move on to the next slide and tell us what you think about educational opportunities.
I think we have a raised hand.
Yeah, I was going to wait until see if I could get one of our first written comments in before I go.
Okay.
We do have here a yes. Keep educational experiences separate from small scale events. This has to have a direct nexus to agriculture. Okay. And Commissioner Park, if you want to unmute yourself.
I wanted to say that this is really an appealing approach. And I want to praise you for the creative thinking that's gone behind it. I really like it. I think of the things that I enjoy doing on say some of our large ranches, horseback riding, e-bike tours, bicycle tours and things. And it's not necessarily just for the thrill of doing that activity. It's really to experience the landscape. And the landscape on a large ranch is not just watching cattle graze. It's looking at this wonderful land stewardship and management that's gone on. So I think you're really onto something with this approach, and I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Park. We have a couple of other comments. Yes, this is how we build resiliency into our local food system. Great idea, no limits. We need to educate the public. I would consider adding the farm to table to this one. And then we have an agree to include farm to table lunches and dinners. So I think that you'll find when we go through our list of other supplemental uses, we have horseback riding. So that's one that's already been allowed on Gaviota, and we're proposing to carry over. So there may be some overlap with some of these different uses. And so our challenge is going to be putting it all into different ordinances that hopefully make sense. Let's see, we have another comment. I would suggest we not allow tours on motorized vehicles for two reasons. First, they can become recreation in the guise of education, but perhaps more important, use of motorized vehicles produces CO2 and climate impacts. Stick with bicycles, horses, hiking. Thank you for those comments. Those are thoughtful comments to consider. We have another agree and like having this as a separate opportunity. a question, do these allow remuneration for the farmer? How does a farmer afford to pay an employee to show people the processes of farming rather than paying them to farm? So I believe the way we understand this ordinance is we're not going to address remuneration. The purpose that we've heard, what people have been interested in with ag enterprises, is that these should be uses that give a farmer an opportunity to earn a little additional income. So if a farmer wants to offer up some of these educational opportunities for a fee to the people who are participating in them, then I think that is the farmers or the landowners, it's in their discretion to make a decision about that. We have another commenter asking, how do you tour an 800 acre cattle ranch on foot or bike? That is another good question. And another commenter says, I believe a multi-day exempt option should exist for educational experiences. Many of our workshops are 3 to 7 days long. Teaching ag to future agriculturalists on ag land needs to be not only exempt, but incentivized. Thank you for those comments.
I want to maybe go back and maybe tease out, and not that everybody has the thought or the comment at this point, but I think one of the things we're trying to tease out, and it relates to the question about larger ranches, and if we're supporting and providing, you know, tours, whether they be agriculture or just experiences of the property, making a distinction, you know, should these be group, you know, using the concept of group-led vehicle tours so that the owner or their employees may be providing the vehicle and taking the people out to the property as a distinction versus individual motorized vehicles, which we're not really looking at, as Julie mentioned. So just throw that out there. If you have any thoughts, please add those, or you could always email Julie or myself any additional thoughts that you might have on how we can make those distinctions as appropriate for this use.
Also, I'd like to kind of tag on to what David just said. If you also have, if you have thoughts tonight, great. If not, you are welcome to email David and I anytime or call us. But if you have thoughts about how many people you think should be allowed at an educational experience, or kind of the frequency, you know, if you have some numbers that you would like to suggest, that would really help us out, because, you know, we're thinking they should be more permissive than events or potentially farm to table dinners, although I'm remembering we do have a comment that would like the farm to table dinner to be under this one. But having some ideas about those numbers would be really helpful if we could hear from all of you about it. So, and while we are thinking about that, I'm going to read a couple of our other comments that are coming in. There are many farmers in our county who would love to educate the next generation, inspire people to support local farms and ag, and have an additional revenue source to make sure their operation is sustainable. We will lose farmers if we don't support them and allow them to explore additional revenue streams. Sonoma, Marin, and SLO counties have demonstrated what a great opportunity this can be. And we have another comment responding to the CO2 question, that vehicles provided by the owner will still produce CO2 and climate impacts. And we have another comment, the creative thinking by staff may unfortunately have comparable creative thinking by others that may not be such good stewards and or neighbors. The county safeguards to ensure abuses to the exemptions must be tight. Exemptions only for 501c3 or certified educational institutions may be appropriate to be considered as a starting point. Okay, thank you for that alternative view. And we have another comment coming in. I would stay out of the business of regulating the educational activity if possible. So no limits if possible. Okay. Okay. Taking a moment to see if anything else comes in the chat or any other raised hands before we move on. It's almost 7 o'clock, but I promise we are getting close to the end of the workshop. So, okay, then let's move on to the next slide. Looks like nothing else is coming in. So we're just about here to finish up. So the remaining uses under the Ag Enterprise Ordinance are those uses that are more directly supplemental to agriculture and more directly related to ag. And with the exception of farm stands, horseback riding, and fishing, none of the uses on this slide would actually bring the public to the site. So these are really more about small scale kinds of processing, product preparation, or lumber processing or firewood processing. So tree nut hulling, which is another kind of real product preparation of one particular type of agricultural product. So the permit exemptions and the permit requirements and the development standards for these uses will likely follow the allowances in the Gaviota Coast Plan, with minor changes to comply with updates to state law and with clarification of some of the definitions. So a number of these uses have an exempt level. Several and fewer of them are only allowed with a land use permit as the lowest permit option. But right now, our intent is to follow the Gaviota Coast Plan with these other particular uses. And next slide. So general Q&A before we leave tonight, we want to give you a final chance to ask anything. Ask any remaining questions about the different uses that we've brought up tonight, or any of the uses that we've talked about in our previous 2 workshops. And also any questions you might have about the supplemental uses that we just brought up on the previous slide. A reminder, this is our last workshop before we begin environmental review, so we encourage you to speak. And in addition to the chat, do raise your hands and wait for the moderator to call on you, and then you'll have an opportunity to speak. So we have a couple already. Would the campsite pay TBID tax? I am wondering if this is, they're talking about the tax, the TOT tax that is paid on at hotels and motels and that sort of thing. Is that the question there?
So, assuming that's the question, the TOT tax, the answer is yes. The campsite is a transient lodging use, so the operator would be required to get a transient occupancy tax certificate from the Treasury Tax Collector's Office, and then would be required to collect and remit those taxes to the tax collector.
Okay, thank you, David. We have a question about beer making or cider making. So we are not adding breweries into the Ag Enterprise Ordinance. That would be an undertaking that would be a bit too large and out of scope for this particular project for us to take it on at this time. We have a question about what is the final day for comments before environmental review. I think we've got a few weeks where you can submit your comments about the scope of the project. We are going to be taking all of the information that we have learned in these different workshops, and we're going to be working on putting together a project description for the environmental review. We are planning to prepare an environmental impact report, and that will require that we circulate for public review and comment a notice of preparation. And that notice of preparation will include a project description that's going to be analyzed under the EIR. And that'll be soliciting public comments about the scope of the environmental review. So that will be the next opportunity for a public response to comment. But until then, if you've got questions, or if you've got suggestions on the Ag Enterprise uses, please do send them to me and David. We have another comment that says staff indicated that the uses on, I believe, the supplemental slide did not bring people to the site. However, farm stands do bring patrons to the site. What are the specific limitations for those? If it is to be limited to only product grown on site, how is the oversight for that administered? So I don't know if I spoke clearly. I think there were 3 uses on that slide which do bring patrons to the site, and farm stands is one of them. We currently have actually in the ordinance already a set of standards that allow farm stands under an exemption on the land, and the Gaviota Coast Plan modified those, and so and I believe they're a little bit more they're a little bit broader in what they allow. And our intent was to bring that over to the Ag 2. But the county, this is one of those uses about how is the oversight of whether it's limited to product grown on the site. Most of our standards will allow product grown on the site, but may allow some sale from nearby sites as well. And as with any land use ordinance and regulation in Santa Barbara County, oversight ultimately is based on zoning enforcement and reports to the county zoning enforcement hotline if somebody is not complying with the standards of the zoning code. We have a comment about tours. Back to tours for large parcels. How about horse-drawn wagon instead of motorized vehicle? That's a great idea. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. It's always good to get more ideas. We have another comment. We have a 100+ acre parcel that is very quiet and has no road noise. We think the ordinances should restrict noise and music to a level that it does not affect adjacent properties. Thank you very much for that comment. That is something to remember for both standards and for when we look at the environmental review later on. We have a question. Does a home occupation fall under any of this, say a wood shop on ag land? It's an interesting question. I would have to hear more, and maybe this is something that you could call me or David or I about the wood shop and what you're talking about, because we do have some limited small scale lumber processing that would be allowed. It currently is allowed in the Gaviota Coast Plan, but it would be allowed on Ag 2 in the future. I do not know if a wood shop falls necessarily under the home occupation. We do have a permit. We do have some permit regulations associated with home occupations in general. They have to be affiliated with the residents on a property. I encourage you to reach out to David or I separately, and then we could understand that better. And let's see, as the written comments are slowing down, I'm going to turn to John Park, who's got his hand raised. And if you want to unmute yourself now, Commissioner Park.
2 things. I want to make a specific comment and then a general one about this. One, I was thinking the same thing about horse-drawn wagons instead of motorized vehicles, but we have to be careful what we wish for. In one of my barns, I store vehicles for the Carriage Museum in Santa Barbara, and we've got several large wagons that were used as like tour buses. They're open air for the large hotels, 120 years ago. And we even have the 50 and Stagecoach, which held 18. And they'd be very interesting to tour around on some of these ranch roads, but you better have a pretty professional teamster controlling those horses on some of those trails. General comment, though, is that I think that this ordinance is a tough one, because it's tough for you folks to work on at P&D, and it's tough for the public to understand it because it's so amorphous. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And I think that your efforts tonight show that a lot of hard thinking has gone into this. And I think we should all be very grateful for that. A caution that I would suggest for both the public and P&D staff is we're going to evaluate this ordinance later. And one way to evaluate it is, did it work or didn't it work? We look at the Gaviota ordinance. There's really been no campgrounds. There's been no farm stays. It hasn't worked. If we look in the future and see that we have a lot of activity that's allowed under this ag enterprise ordinance, then we can say it has worked. Ag tourism in general will be a tremendous benefit to the county. It'll be a tremendous benefit to agriculture and to landowners, to allow them to keep their lands. It is something where I think we want to see this ordinance as it's successful if it enhances ag tourism. It's really not going to be successful if its main reason is to restrict it. But I really appreciate your effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Park. I did have just one thought popped into my head when you mentioned how have things been going or working or not working on Gaviota. And there is one possible situation, and maybe this applies to the campgrounds, but some of the uses may not be consistent with Santa Barbara County's current uniform rules. And we are going to be taking these uses to the Ag Preserve Advisory Committee, and we're going to talk to them about these uses and ask about their potential consistency with uniform rules, as well as whether we should be amending the uniform rules as a part of this project to allow some of these uses if they currently are not consistent. I know that there's a lot of the ag land in Gaviota is under Williamson Act contracts. And so that's always a potential. There's no point in allowing a bunch of additional uses on ag lands if they're not consistent with the uniform rules. And so much of our lands, I think it's about maybe it's over 60%, I think it is, if I'm recalling, of our Ag 2 lands are under Williamson Act. So we do want to make sure that we have consistency there. Otherwise, then that would be a reason why this effort wouldn't work. So, so thank you, Commissioner Park, for bringing home those points. Looking at some of the other comments that came in while Commissioner Park was speaking. Someone commenting that the uses tonight are not as offensive as cannabis. We have some agreements with Commissioner Park's statements. We have a request to definitely, yes, amend the uniform rules so that we can allow those uses. So I don't see any other hands raised. Again, this is kind of your opportunity to speak up with your voice instead of your fingers, and hope that we can hear looking for any other final comments here before we close out our workshop. So we have a new comment. Coastal Commission has required county to allow more short-term rentals in the coastal zone. Hopefully, some of these activities will promote more public access to Ag 1 properties along Gaviota and countywide. Thank you for those comments. I see another raised hand, Mary Hayden. If you would like to unmute yourself and speak.
Yeah, I just wanted to really agree with what Commissioner Park said and point out that the flyer you sent out in your email blast has a picture of what was the Hanson Schley Ranch on the front of it that had to be sold off 10 years ago because they couldn't make ends meet. And I think the whole point of doing this is to allow agriculture to continue in the San Ynez Valley and in Santa Barbara County. And yeah, I hope that we can do it in a large enough scale that works for everyone and doesn't step on anyone else's feet. But, you know, agriculture is a really key part of San Ynez Valley and our view shed and our environment and our wildlife. So I hope everyone can keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hayden.
Hey, Julie, this is Rob Hazard. Would you mind if I made a quick comment too, a follow-up comment?
Oh, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I just would like to add to that last comment that from County Fire's perspective, a viable agricultural industry in Santa Barbara County is vital to our interests to provide fire protection. The ranch lands and farmlands of Santa Barbara County basically provide an enormous amount of buffer to our urban communities from wildfire. So as we see some of these parcels, when they lose their agricultural business and they convert to residential housing or vacant land, suddenly we lose our grazing, we lose orchards, and we start to get the situation that we see in some of the foothills of Goleta and Santa Barbara, where we have an increase in risk to the wildland urban interface. So from the fire department's standpoint, keeping agriculture viable in this county is synonymous with the fire department's mission to provide fire protection. So we would holistically support the efforts that we're working on this evening to maintain that viability.
Thank you. So, if we have no more questions and comments, I'm going to kind of give this as a last call. Okay, let's return to our slides. And we're going to finish up. I mentioned a few moments ago that we are going to go to the Ag Preserve Advisory Committee and talk about the uniform rules and these uses. We're also going to return to the Ag Advisory Committee, or AAC, and give them an update on the project. And then we're going to be working on drafting a project description and some ordinance language, and then start the environmental review, and that'll get kicked off with a notice of preparation, which will be released to the public. And then once environmental review is done, we'll have Planning Commission and Board of Supervisors hearings, and then we'll take the coastal version to the Coastal Commission to request certification. Next slide. I'd like to remind everyone of our project website, countyofsb.org/ag-enterprise. And that's where you can get more updates on this project as they become available. We will be posting notes from tonight's workshop, as well as a link to the recording on this website. If you're interested in farm stays, please visit the farm stays website for more information. And finally, as it may affect agricultural lands, we continue to encourage you to keep track of the Recreation Master Plan at sbrecplan.com. And next slide. That concludes our workshop. And I thank you for taking your time out of your evening and your busy schedules to attend tonight. And I thank you for all of your input. My contact information, both email and phone number are on this slide. So please feel free to contact me if you've got any further comments or questions or suggestions. Thank you all for attending.
And Julie, I just wanted to say thanks to everybody too. It's been very informative to be part of this workshop, and the department's supportive. And I think overall the county's supportive of making these, as Rob Hazard said, making these agricultural operations and that have been in families for a very long time, resilient, and allowing them some additional uses to help supplement their income. It's a really important part of the legacy in this community. So thanks again for participation, and great job to the staff for the hard work you guys did.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good night. Have a good evening.